Dear colleagues, dear students, dear guests, and dear Professor Schatzki. On behalf of the Department of Learning and Philosophy, I want to welcome you warmly to this event this afternoon. In university, it's very important that it's a tradition to attract very famous persons from all over the world to universities, to faculties, to departments, and that's formally what's happening today, that we are welcoming very much Professor Schatzki to the Department of Learning and Philosophy as an adjunct professor. And this act of attracting well-known researchers, globally well-known professors to a department is a tradition in universities. And of course we do it to support the sharing of knowledge and to support the level of the quality of our research in the department. And that's also what we hope will happen with this event today, that will come closer to you, Professor Schatzki, and share knowledge, and you can tell us from all over the world what is happening within your field. Of course, attracting well-known people from all over the world to a department calls for finances. And that's why we are very happy that the Opel Foundation has constructed a new visiting professor scheme program in the Faculty of Humanities in Aalborg University. So today we are very much saying thank you to the Opel Foundation for supporting us in attracting Professor Schatzki to our department. I'm just now going to tell you a bit about what's going to happen. Then different people will enter the stage here and do different things. And of course, Professor Schatzki will give his speech too. First of all, we'll have some words from the Dean of Humanities in Aalborg University. And he's not here physically, but in the modern world you can be here without being here. So we'll show him on the screen with a welcoming talk to Professor Schatzki. That will happen in a couple of minutes. And after that, Professor Buch, sitting down here, will enter the stage and give a more detailed introduction to Professor Schatzki before he gives his speech. And then you, Professor Schatzki, will enter the stage and give a lecture for about 3/4 of an hour. And you have seen the title, I hope. So far it's interesting, isn't it? Yes, with a twist of enthusiasm and fun, whatever. I don't know what will happen after the title, but you will tell us. Yes, and then, which is very interesting and characterizes you, I think, is that after the formal speech, we'll have a slot and quite some time for discussing. So for asking questions, commenting, whatever. So please start now preparing questions for Professor Schatzki to raise them after the speech. And we have set aside some time, so you better prepare some questions. Yes, and then after all this has happened, we go to the fun part, or the even more fun part, which is the reception. which will be given outside. Yet is it outside here? Yeah, yeah. And you are very welcome to take part in the reception. So for now, I'll just say, on behalf of the Department of Learning Philosophy, warmly welcome here. Prepare questions. Prepare to enter into discussion. We are very interactive. That's why it's going to happen in this way. And you are too, so that's very, very nice. Yeah, and you allowed that too, no problem. No, I'll say warmly welcome to all of you, and then I will leave the floor to the Dean and a technician up here. Is that you, Anders? Yeah? Helping the Dean, that's what we like, yes? So the Dean will say some words about Professor Schatzki and attracting such a famous person to our department and to the Faculty of Humanities.
My name is Henrik Kalkjær and I'm Dean of the Humanities here at Aalborg University. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Theodore Schatzki to Aalborg University. It's always a great pleasure to welcome a scholar of international standing, but it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome Professor Schatzki to Aalborg and to the Faculty of the Humanities. And the reason for this is quite a simple one, namely that on the one hand, Professor Schatzki in his works combine deep theoretical reflection and rigor with the ability to apply his general ideas to a diverse set of fields of human activity, management, sustainability, learning, you name it. And in that sense, he's generated a lot of interest and inspired a lot of research in lots of different areas within the humanities, also within the social sciences, and indeed beyond. So therefore, in a sense, the ability to combine theoretical reflection on the one hand with looking at specific types of human activity is very much something that is the ambition, and indeed also to a very large extent the practice of scholars working at the Faculty of the Humanities here in Aalborg. So therefore, I'm sure that the appointment of Professor Schatzki as adjunct professor will mark the beginning of a fruitful and interesting intellectual endeavor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will read this introduction to Professor Schatzki because it has some details that I cannot remember. But anyway, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Schatzki to you. Professor Schatzki is today recognized as one of the pioneering scholars within practice theory, which increasingly has become more important for understanding innovation, change, and learning processes in society. His work is internationally referenced and acclaimed as fundamental contributions to outlining a systematic and theoretical underpinning of contemporary practice theory. Professor Schatzki holds a bachelor's degree in applied mathematics from Howard College, a B.Phil in philosophy from Oxford University, and a master's degree and a PhD in philosophy from the University of California in Berkeley. Presently, Professor Schatzki holds the office of the Dean at the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Kentucky. His highly respected, as testified by his career, including a long line of fellowships, grants, honors, and positions at renowned universities in the USA, in Europe, and in Australia. He has published extensively in high-ranking journals and within recognized publishers. He's also very active as an editor of scientific journals and anthologies. His academic production includes 4 books, 5 edited volumes, and 67 peer-reviewed articles several reviews, and more. Amongst his numerous productions, I would like to draw attention to some of his seminal contributions. In 1996, Professor Schatzki published the monograph Social Practices, a Wittgensteinian Approach to Human Activity and the Social. Drawing on the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein, Professor Schatzki argues that social practices constitute both might and action, and he outlines how doings and sayings are interlinked through practical understandings, rules, and teleoffective structures. His fundamental characterization of social practices has since then influenced his work and inspired, indeed, scholars in a range of different academic disciplines. In his 2002 book, The Side of the Social, a philosophical account of the constitution of social life and change, he further elaborates his position and develops a systematic ontological account of social existence and how social orders are transformed over time. Here, he positions his account in a dialogue with contemporary social theorists such as Anthony Giddens, Pierre Bourdieu, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Bruno Latour, and others. Professor Schatzki defends a position that holds that we must understand human activity as transpiring in contextual sites where things exist and events happen. Finally, let me draw your attention to another of Professor Schatzki's systematic investigations. In 2010, in his 2010 book, The Time Space of Human Activity, he explores how human activity can be understood as teleological events. Inspired by Martin Heidegger's theorizing of time in Time Inside, he develops an event ontology that situates humans' existence in textures of social practices and material arrangements. The versatility and quality of Professor Schatzki's research contribution and his continuous work on locating, transcending, and confronting key issues in the intersection of philosophy, social science, and theories of action is impressive and important. He represents a research profile and a contribution which is very relevant to our university. So, before I give the word to Professor Schatzki, let me thank the assessment committee for recommending Professor Schatzki as adjunct professor at the Department of Learning and Philosophy at Aalborg University. So many thanks to Professor Vivi Jensen, who will headed the assessment committee, sitting right over there, to Professor Bente Halkjær from Roskilde University, and to Professor Christian Larsen, also from Aalborg University. And now, Professor Schatzki will explain to us what practices got to do with this.
Well, after that generous introduction, I feel like we should move right to the reception. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the position I occupy. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. I'm very pleased to see so many people here, and I'm very pleased to be able to use this lecture to inaugurate what I hope will be a fruitful, long relationship with the university here. I didn't quite know what to do in so-called inaugural talk. So it was suggested that maybe a bunch of the people in the audience wouldn't know what practice theory is. So I'm going to give kind of my take on practice theory. It's sort of an overview. And I have to warn you that I am a philosopher by training. And some of you probably know that philosophy is a very muscular discipline. And that means that professors of philosophy like to challenge their audiences. So they write out intricate papers and read them out loud and expect the audience to understand everything they're saying and to be able to interact intelligently afterwards. And that's not a very good way of operating. Unfortunately, I find it impossible to shake the habit of writing out papers. I've never given a PowerPoint presentation in my life. I used to bring slideshows with photographs of like nice outdoor scenes. But then I began to suspect people were just looking at the slides and not listening to what I was saying, so I thought this wasn't a good idea. So I'm afraid that you're going to have to listen to me read a talk, but I'll try to read slowly. And can you all hear me? Okay, it's all right if I, okay, so I'm not going to hold the microphone then. Okay, so this is called, with apologies to Tina Turner, on practice theory, or what's practices got to do with it. So social theorists have long taken different approaches to conceptualizing and explaining social affairs. The classic 19th century opposition between J.S. Mill's individualism and Hegel's corporatism identifies two important forms these approaches have taken. Waves of succession have passed over the forest of contending approaches since the Second World War, leaving behind a dense thicket of competitors, not just individualism and corporatism, or individualism and collectivism, but also, and now just focusing on sociology and geography alone, functionalism, structuralism, structural functionalism, post-structuralism, systems theory, complexity theory, emergentism, critical realism, interactionism, symbolic interactionism, ethnomethodology, phenomenology, genealogy, field theory, actor network theory, theories of performativity, institutionalism, evolutionism, and cognitivism. Not to mention competing epistemological theories such as realism, relativism, historicism, hermeneutics, social constructivism, and feminist epistemology. In recent years, a new entrant has appeared, practice theory. The label practice theory was first, to my knowledge, used in 1984 by the anthropologist Sherry Ortner to name the ideas of Pierre Bourdieu. Since then, the term has come to denote a stream of thought, boasting varied theorists whose ideas have been appropriated in numerous disciplines for the investigation of diverse social phenomena. The disciplines involved include sociology, geography, organization studies, education, political science, and history. And the phenomena and issues addressed include consumption, economic production, high-tech startups, migration, teaching, learning, art, natural resource use, energy use, organizations, professions, the secondary insurance market, and international relations. Now, my aim today is to provide an overview of the stream of thought and inquiry. My goal is not to advance practice theory in the sense of providing any new ideas or using practice theory to investigate further phenomena. Rather, I hope to give you a sense of what this general approach is about, why it is spreading, what it is good for, and some of its limits. Okay, so the first section is called, What is Practice Theory? The social sciences include anthropology, economics, geography, history, maybe, organization studies, political science and sociology, parts of linguistics, psychology, and education, and the occasional humanistic endeavor. What these disciplines share is the study of social life. Saying this presumes that the range of phenomena that qualify as social is quite broad, from pas de deux to international arms agreements, from school classes to mortgage markets, from trepidation before a public appearance to the European Union, from the mass movements of peoples and goods and non-standard forms of language to racial prejudice, heated arguments, and uneven distributions of educational and economic opportunities. The study of these phenomena has a theoretical dimension, where by theory I simply mean abstract general thought. Many social investigators, particularly those whose research converges with types of research found in the natural sciences, they believe that the ultimate point of theory is to deliver explanations of social phenomena, that is, accounts of how and why these phenomena are as they are. These researchers tend to push theory in the direction of models or collections of laws or generalizations. Very empiricist researchers of the scientistic type also often treat hypotheses as theories. By contrast, investigators of a more humanistic character, in a very broad sense of the word humanistic, do not believe that the point of theory is to yield explanations alone. Their theories often do deliver explanations, typically involving narratives or temporal sequences, that is, mechanisms, but their theories aim at wider comprehension, not just explanation, but understanding and interpretation too. Not just why and how, but what things mean and what they add up to as well. For these researchers, the relation of theories to empirical research is threefold. First, theories provide concepts with which investigators describe, explain, and interpret social affairs. Second, theories suggest interesting topics or angles for investigation. And third, theories umbrella data and findings under particular conceptual schemes. The family of approaches that go under the label practice theory are theories of this humanistic sort. They do not formulate laws or develop models, though they are certainly full of generalizations, even universal ones. They address topics of an abstract general nature, for instance, power, ontology, social reproduction, providing ways of thinking about these topics that give researchers conceptual tools for describing, explaining, and interpreting social phenomena, and for collecting their findings and analyses under single conceptual schemes. Practice theory is one of many streams in the social disciplines that develop general frameworks, that's in quotation marks, through which researchers investigate particular phenomena. Now, although practice theory is now a well-established label, there is no one definitive way to demarcate what qualifies as one. Most observers will attest that the theories I call practice theories qualify. But not only can practice theory be defined in multiple ways, but theorists have identified wider collections of approaches that can be called theories of a practice sort. An example is the collection of approaches called practice-based accounts. This is a very prevalent expression in organization studies. I am not here today going to explore relations between the narrower range of theories I call practice theories and the wider vista of practice approaches. Okay, so the first feature of the theories I call practice theories is that they treat social life as composed, at least principally, of practices. These theories agree on neither what a practice is nor what it is for social phenomena to be composed of them. But they concur that practices are central to social affairs, and in fact, their conceptions of practices reveal deep similarities. For example, all practice theories conceptualize practices as carried on by multiple, indeed indefinitely many people. A practice is not something that one person alone could enact. A second key feature of practice theories arises from the fact that the world does not contain one practice, but many. Practices connect. The different practices that make up social life hang together and form complexes, which in turn connect into larger constellations. This vision of practices forming complexes and constellations is the second feature of practice theories. The third feature arises from the second. It is the idea that social phenomena, including power, science and religion, racial and ethnic prejudice, migration, organizations, and the dissemination of knowledge, etc., social phenomena are either aspects of, constellations of, or rooted in nexes of practices. Upholding this idea requires treating one's subject matter as constituted or rooted in practice nexuses. It also requires explaining these matters by reference to phenomena that either are aspects or features of practice nexuses or are compatible with the social world consisting in these. For example, someone who studies competition among high-tech startups might first conceptualize startups and competition among them in terms of nexuses of such practices as advertising, hiring, strategic planning, price determination, consumption, and purchasing, and two, explain how such competition works, as well as the fates of particular firms and markets through the dynamics of such nexuses. A fourth and final feature is that practice theories arise on the background of the philosophical ideas of Ludwig Wittgenstein and Martin Heidegger. An especially crucial idea in this context is that human activity rests on something that cannot be formulated. Diverse conceptions or names exist of this something, including habitus, practical consciousness, practical understanding, and skills. These expressions all denote capacities or dispositions to do things, whose bearing on human activity are inadequately captured by the significance or implications for such activity of any finite collection of symbolic formulations. Capacities and dispositions also correspond to what Gilbert Ryle dubbed know-how, which according to him is a fundamental type of knowledge alongside know-that. In sum, the four features I'm using to demarcate practice theory are first, viewing practices as central to the composition of social life. Second, holding that practices form wider complexes and constellations. Third, claiming that social phenomena are constituted or rooted in these complexes and constellations. And fourth, believing that human activity rests on practical capacities that cannot be put into words. Prominent practice theorists include Pierre Bourdieu, Anthony Giddens, Jean Lave, and less explicitly, Charles Taylor. These four can be dubbed first-generation practice theorists. A second generation of practice theorists includes Andreas Reckwitz, Stephen Kemmis, Elizabeth Shove and Associates, Sylvia Giraldi, and myself. Now, anyone who knows these individuals' ideas knows how disparate they are. They promulgate different conceptions of practices, of the connections among practices, of the relations of social phenomena to the complexes and constellations of practices, and of the capacities that underlie action. Despite this diversity, it is important to emphasize two general commonalities in their conceptions of practice. The first is that practices are organized activities. This core idea implies that uncovering and understanding particular practices, for example, those of teaching, or of politics, or of commerce, doing this requires identifying both the actions that compose these practices and their organization. Of course, practice theorists, as I am demarcating them, are not alone in emphasizing the centrality to social affairs of organized activities. Closely related approaches such as McIntyrean accounts of practice, social cultural action theory, and neo-Marxist praxis theory share this intuition. These and further approaches also share an opposition to individualism, since organized actions are not reducible to individuals and their properties. In particular, the organizations are not so reducible. A second commonality in practice theorists' conception of practices is that practices are intimately entwined with materiality. Some practice theorists treat materiality as part of practices, whereas others believe that materiality is distinct from but intimately connected to practices. Members of both camps, however, see materiality wherever they espy practices. Again, practice theorists are not alone in emphasizing materiality. Attention to materiality is a major feature of social thought in the past 20 years. Okay, part 2, the popularity of practice theory. As mentioned, practice theoretical ideas have been appropriated in various disciplines to study a range of phenomena. Before offering several shaky ideas about why these ideas have attained modest notoriety, it is advisable first to give another illustration of what it is to appropriate them. As explained, appropriating a practice theoretical approach involves treating the phenomena or topic one studies as either constituted or rooted in complexes and constellations of practices. Suppose one wants to study teaching and how teachers interact with children of different backgrounds and statuses. Doing so practice theoretically requires conceptualizing teaching as a practice or as something that takes place in multiple practices and uncovering the wider nexuses of practices of which this practice or practices are part. Doing this in turn requires tracing connections among the practices involved. Details of these practices, their constituent activities and organization will likely also be relevant, as will the material entities and settings amid which they are carried on. In proceeding thus, an investigator employs the conceptual apparatus of practice theory to conceptualize her subject matter. Explaining whatever differences are discovered in interactions between teachers and students of different backgrounds and statuses is a further step. Appropriating practice theoretical ideas and giving explanation involves 2 moves. The first move is restricting possible explanatory factors to matters that either pertain to practices or nexuses thereof, for instance, rules, or the factors that are compatible with a practice construal of the phenomena to be explained, for instance, beliefs. The second move is treating possible explanatory factors as occurring in the context of practices when gauging their significance. So, the present question is, why have increasing numbers of steadily more disciplinary, diverse researchers both conceptualized subject matters with practice theoretical frameworks and funneled searches for explanations through such frameworks? Note that practice theory is hardly the only theoretical stream to gather followers in the last 20 years. Critical realism has grown during the same period, as has actor network theory, which has enjoyed great popularity. Other ways of thinking have maintained long-standing strength during this time. For example, interactionism and individualism. Individualism is still king. Still, practice theoretical research has spread during this period, and this is what we want to understand. Whenever changes in scientific practices are the subject of a study, the discussion confronts the unholy duality of cause and reason, and the likelihood that some mix of the two, very hard to disentangle, is responsible for the changes to be understood. For example, part of the causal explanation of the rise of practice theory likely lies in the attraction that particular practice theorists have exerted as dissertation and post-dissertation supervisors. And the best examples are Elizabeth Shove, Stephen Kemmis, and Andreas Rekvitz. The significance of this pull should not be underestimated, especially in a domain such as social theory that contains an accumulating archive of new and enduring approaches to social life. Of course, poles of attraction are impotent if people are not sensitive to them. Here, too, causality plays a role in the form, for instance, of suggestions from teachers and peers that lead someone to study with a particular individual instead of others. Reasons, too, presumably, have something to do with the matter. Another causal factor that should be mentioned in this context is restlessness. disciplines differ in how theoretically restless their students and professors are, thus in the degrees to which practitioners are susceptible to and seek out new approaches, whether indigenous to the discipline or imported from without. I mention this factor because practice theory has enjoyed success in some disciplines, such as geography and organization studies, that manifest great restlessness. I think there should be contrasted to sociology, which is a very unrestless discipline, I believe. A final and related cause lies in the concept or word practice itself. In contemporary humanistic social theory, the word practice sounds both ancient and cutting edge. Aristotle was the first philosopher to make extensive use of the concept, and the remarkable depth of his insights on practice have lent the concept considerable gravitas. At the same time, since the middle of the 20th century, the word practice has been carried on the banner of offenses against cognitivism, intellectualism, theoristic conceptions of science, and such dualisms as subject and object and action and structure. This fact lends the concept exciting intellectual cachet. This powerful combination of venerableness and progressiveness has created an aura of ferment and fascination that favors the dissemination of practice thinking in social research. Meanwhile, what sort of reasons might have led researchers to practice theoretical frameworks? One reason, or is this a cause, lies in the majesty of the work of first-generation practice theorists Bourdieu, Giddens, Lave, and Taylor. These thinkers have attracted extensive followings that extend or apply their ideas. They have also inspired second-generation practice theorists and sparked the dissemination of practice theoretical ideas. Bourdieu, Giddens, Lave, and Taylor are all heroes in social thought. A related reason concerns the role that early success plays in attracting believers. Practice theoretical approaches were made more credible through the illumination found in such theoretically informed empirical analyses as Bourdieu on French society, Lave on mathematics, Chauve on consumption, Girardi on organizational learning and knowing, Breckwitz on subject cultures, Alan Ward on eating, and chemists on education. A third reason lies in the relation of practice to action. Practice theory, as stated, opposes individualism. In particular, it claims that actions are essentially social events. It also holds, however, that practices are composed of actions, though not only this. So practices are at once more than actions, but closely bound up with actions. As a result, practice theories simultaneously satisfy two itches. The first itch is the desire to transcend individualism. The second is the evidentness of upholding the central role of action in social and human life. Of course, practice theory is not the only approach to satisfy these two desires. Interactionism and social cultural activity theory, to take just two examples, do so too. Moreover, many researchers do not seek to transcend individualism. Still, I believe this intimate relation of practices to actions helps explain why practice theory has attracted increasing numbers of researchers. And I will mention one final, really shaky reason. It is what can be called the experiential salience of practice theory. This is a phenomenological concept. To be experientially salient is to ring true in experience. Now, this is admittedly a slippery concept. Different people have different experiences of the same events and entities due to divergent attitudes, ideas, and prior experiences, as well as due to the vagaries of attention. As a result, what rings true in one person's experience might not do so in others. What I mean then in claiming that practice theory is experientially salient is that practice theoretical concepts ring true in the experiences of people schooled in social thought and social research. However, the previous caveat holds just as much of this restricted group. So, what I really mean is that these concepts ring true in the experience of some people schooled in social thought and research, and that these individuals thereby become more disposed to conduct research with or through these concepts. And what in particular I think has purchased in these individuals' experiences is the idea that actions are organized into bundles, that is, practices. Note that the experiential salience of this idea is both evidenced in and partly established by the facts that natural languages contain common terms for practices, and that speakers can readily apply them to what they experience. Examples are teaching, cooking, demonstrating, driving. A second idea that enjoys experiential salience is that practices form complexes. In many of the settings through which they live, kitchens, meeting rooms, gyms, city squares, and so on, people encounter and effortlessly comprehend that multiple practices are carried on interrelatedly. After all, people readily refer to and talk about connections among, say, cooking, entertaining family, and other practices in the kitchen, at least in the United States now. If you have people over your house, no one ever leaves the kitchen. So there are a lot of different things going on there. I would even say that people can see these things, though I won't develop a case here for this probably counterintuitive assertion. Okay, section 3. Is practice theory better than other ontologies? As mentioned in the introduction, a large number of theoretical approaches to social life coexist today in the social disciplines. This multiplicity naturally raises questions, such as, are any of these approaches better than the others? And if so, how do we know which approaches are better or best? A related question is whether any of these approaches is true, or at least truer than the others. To simplify my remarks on these topics, I will temporarily set aside both theory in general and practice theory in general, and focus on one kind of theory, namely ontology, and in particular, practice theoretical ontologies. Social theories offer abstract, general, and systematic thoughts about social life. The most abstract such theories are ontologies. Ontologies specify the basic or fundamental nature, elements, dimensions, or structures of things. In this case, the basic nature or elements, etc., of social life. The claim that social practices are central to the composition of social phenomena is an ontological assertion. So too are the actor-network claim that society is composed of networks of human and non-human actors. The symbolic, I should say post-society for them, the symbolic interactionist claim that meaningful interactions are the building blocks of social affairs. And the individualist claim that all social phenomena are ultimately composed of individuals and their properties. A different sort of ontological thesis is the proposition that human action is the principal cause in social life. Or Bourdieu's thesis that the habitus that underlies human activity is structurally homologous with both practice fields and the layouts of material environments. Note that ontologies can take different forms: books, whole books, chapters, chapter sections, sentences. Ontologies can also be presupposed unformulated by any or all of these. So, for example, take the books of Bourdieu. His ontological works include Outline of a Theory of Practice and The Logic of Practice, and other books of his apply the ontology developed in this book to particular domains. For example, his book Distinction, Homo Academicus, or Science of Science and Reflexivity. Now, the most prominent ontological families include, in the social sciences, include individualism, interactionism, holism with a W, so you have to have a whole there, theories of becoming, and different flavors of structuralism, including classic French, American network, and British critical realists. These are all versions of structuralism. This variety ensures that incompatible structural accounts can be given of the same phenomena. I have already indicated that which ontology a researcher appropriates can rest on contingent features of her biography and experience, and that the space for reason to help determine ontological choices is circumscribed. Despite this, discerning observers and participants want to know which ontologies are better or best. Now, one approach to this issue is to say that an ontology is better the truer it is, hence that the best theory is the truest. I am not going to pursue this idea today, in part because the topic of truth is arcane. For example, some philosophers hold that it is not clear what it is for one set of propositions or sentences to be truer than another. It's either all or not, either true or false. There are no degrees. Moreover, even if the idea of degrees of truth is set aside, it is not clear that one ontology is simply true and the others are all false. One could, for example, plausibly claim that just as truth is multiple, that is, any set of events and entities is subject to multiple true descriptions, which is a truth, different ontologies each get something right about the world. You could say the world's a very complex place, and all those different ontological families I mentioned each get something right. So those of you who know Nietzsche, who said objectivity was combining as many and holding together as many different perspectives as possible. To complicate matters still further, different understandings exist of how this could be the case, that different ontologies get something right. So once truth is bracketed, two principal criteria of a good ontology emerge. Theories, including ontologies, are developed through argument, elaboration, and appropriation. Argument is the provision of considerations for and against claims, whereas elaboration is the spinning out of an idea's or theories, meanings, and implications, and appropriation is the interpretation of preceding ideas. Since ontologies are developed through argument, elaboration, and appropriation, an ontology is good first if it is rationally sensible. Now, rationally sensible means that convincing arguments and interpretations can be provided for the ontology, that elaborating it does not reveal deficiencies, and that the ontology jibes with, or at least is not contravened, by experience and knowledge. Of course, convincingness, like deficiency and consistency, lies in the eye of the beholder and is subject to all the kinds of contingent biographical and contextual factors that lead researchers to favor one ontology over another. No argument, for instance, is likely to convince an individualist that human actions are essentially organized as practices, just like no argument is likely to convince a practice theorist that practices, like other social phenomena, are nothing but compendia of features of individual people. In addition, an argument or interpretation is convincing only until a more convincing one appears. Still, within a given community of social theorists and researchers, and despite their frailty and contingency, argument, elaboration, and interpretation do provide reasons for upholding certain positions versus others. They do therefore rationally support some ontologies while undermining others. Now, I obviously think that arguments, elaborations, and interpretations that favor practice theoretical ontologies are convincing. So I'll leave it to others to deliver unbiased, or rather differently biased, judgments. As for the second criterion, I said earlier that a central contribution of theory to empirical investigation is the provision of concepts and ways of thinking for use in describing, explaining, and interpreting the world. It follows that a second criterion of a good ontology is usefulness. An ontology is good if researchers can use its concepts to do these things. Accordingly, evidence for this goodness lies in the prevalence of these uses of an ontology and in trends of such usage over time. If an ontology's concepts are increasingly used, its goodness is steadily revealed. Now, it's important to point out that neither argument nor usefulness is likely to reduce a field of competing ontologies to a single best one. As indicated, arguments and so forth are provisional, and their convincingness is relative to biographical and contextual factors. Often, consequently, researchers will stand by different arguments. What's more, the number of contending arguments can become so great as to make it impossible to discern which are right. This is the situation, in my opinion, in many areas of philosophy, and social ontology is moving in that direction. All the same, it is important to acknowledge that rational discourse can thin the field of competitors. Usefulness, too, does not pick out unique best ontologies. Practice theory enjoys a growing following among empirical researchers, but other ontologies enjoy or retain significant, indeed larger followings, including actor network theory, symbolic interactionism, and individualisms of various sorts. All four ontological approaches, as a result, qualify as good. People tend to think that there's a single best theory for anything. Social research, by contrast, needs to embrace the idea that there are multiple good ontologies. Note that the existence of this multiplicity should not be turned back to impugn the value of usefulness as a criterion of goodness, for the criterion does play a useful whittling role. Only a subset of existing and past ontologies are appropriated in empirical social research. Others are ignored or forgotten as empirical research proceeds. So usefulness does narrow the range of good ontologies, though it will never, outside a totalitarian society, and even there, identify a single best one. Hence, the family of practice ontologies is good and looks better all the time. But there are other good ontological families too. Okay, section 4. What is practice theory good for? For exactly what, however, is practice theory good, that is, useful? Consider a partial list of phenomena of which illuminating practice theoretical analyses have been given. Eating, Nordic walking, washing machine use, cycling, mobility, day trading on the NASDAQ market, domestic energy use, household waste, sustainable design, sustainable consumption, temporalities of consumption, teaching, learning, the work of ambulance paramedics or of lawyers, anxiety, memory, communities of practice, and organizational learning and knowledge. At first glance, these phenomena might seem to be small, local, or somehow limited in scope, for they seem to be nothing more than people doing particular things in particular settings. In fact, of course, the activities involved can be pervasive and their effects cumulative and significant. Household waste, for instance, is everywhere, while also accumulating in certain places. It is not small, local, or relatively limited in scope. What is true, however, is that the above list is missing familiar large phenomena, such as governments, wars, international finance systems, the Premier League, the commercial music industry, and markets in stolen antiquities. Indeed, word is out that practice theory is good at analyzing local or small phenomena, but not good at analyzing larger ones. If this claim were true, the goodness of practice ontologies would be circumscribed. They would be good for exploring only some of the things that social researchers study. Now, the first thing to say about this situation is that most families of ontology face a predicament of this sort. For example, the rumor going about practice theory also applies to actor network theory. It too seems best at analyzing smaller, more local phenomena. In recent years, Michel Calon has attempted to subject economies and markets to a kind of post-actor network analysis. But he has not produced the sort of comprehensive accounts that, say, orthodox economics has concocted. In fact, today, few ontologies beyond individualism are actively appropriated in the study of both small or local and large or global social phenomena. Theorists such as Bourdieu and Nicolas Luhmann claim that their theories apply to just about everything in social life, but I'm not sure that their optimism has been borne out by empirical research. A second thing to say about this situation is that it might not be problematic if certain families of ontology are good for studying things of certain types and other families are good for studying things of other types. Perhaps it is best to think of an ontological division of labor. Why does one theory have to cover everything? I am not, however, going to pursue this suggestion presently, for just about all social ontologies aspire, at least theoretically, to capture social life at large. This is certainly true of practice ontologies. I just cited Bourdieu as someone who wants his theories to capture social life in toto. Giddens harbors the same aspiration. Consider his great 1979 book, Central Problems in Social Theory. The second chapter of that book outlines the chief concepts of a general ontology, which is then further elaborated in the Constitution of Society. Subsequent chapters then use that ontology to formulate positions on various prominent social theoretical issues. Similar ambitions have informed the work of Chauve, Reckwitz, and myself. However, and this is the third thing I want to say, practice theory ontology and research is an expanding enterprise. As I speak, practice theorists are seeking to develop conceptual resources for analyzing large or distributed phenomena. The earliest example of such analysis is, I think, Reckwitz's 2006 account of subject. I should take this back. This is not right because I have Bourdieu in the senses before this. But a prominent example of such analysis is, I know, Reckwitz's 2006 account of subject cultures, where a subject culture is a dominant regime of ways of being a person that holds sway over a large expanse of space and time. A more recent example is the 2015 book of the Global Reinsurance Agency by Paula Jarzabowski and Associates, which examines how traders and brokers in multiple locations manage, through their actions, to secure the shared practices that constitute a market in insurance risk. At present writing, further authors are essaying to develop practice theoretical analyses and ways of thinking about large phenomena. Consequently, the jury is still out on how wide a range of phenomena practice theory is useful for analyzing. Another subject matter that some observers have claimed practice ontologies are not good at illuminating is people. The criticism in this context is that practice theories are so fixated on practices and connections among practices that they neglect to analyze the people whose actions constitute those practices. These ontologies do conceptualize people as practitioners, but, so the complaint says, such a conceptualization does not amount to, but instead is only the starting point for an analysis of individuals. Like the observation about large phenomena, there's something to this claim. It is, however, a little inaccurate. For example, a rather robust account of people is found in Bourdieu's account of habitus and fields. It's just that the account makes people versions of one another and has not found much favor. Moreover, Reckwitz's aforecited work on subject cultures is all about the formation of individuals, though it does admittedly focus on the social matrix in which they are formed. More recently, authors such as Thomas Alkemeyer, Robert Schmidt, and Gert Spargarten and Don Wienig have developed practice analyses of key dimensions of being and emotion: learning, reflection, and emotions. And one must not forget the fascinating work of Ole Dreyer, which is all about the twists and turns of being an individual person moving through a world of practices, organizing his or her life. Finally, my own work has always incorporated detailed analyses of mind and action in its account of practices. In short, practice theory offers promising ideas for analyzing individual people. And of course, it is quite good at comprehending the social context in which individuals form and persist. In short, the goodness of particular ontologies as measured by usefulness can wax or wane. Topics for which practice theory has not been useful might become ones for whose analyses it provides advantageous concepts and ideas, or maybe not. Because practice researchers seek to add to and extend the reach of practice theoretical frameworks, observers should keep an open mind. In addition to building out these frameworks, practice theorists should also continue developing arguments for, elaborations of, and interpretations of them. And that was the first criterion of a good ontology. Okay, and this is the final section now called the frontiers of practice theory. Although practice theory might be useful for analyzing more topics than those for which it has already proved valuable, the extension of practice theoretical concepts and ways of thinking is not potentially endless. I do not believe that practice theory is or should aspire to be a TOE, a theory of everything. The great example of that today is Darwinism. So you have the explanatory selectionist schema, so it is a claim, applies to every phenomena in the universe of any kind. So there are people that write books about this. For instance, practice theory is not likely to provide insight into the anatomical development of human fetuses, though it is not implausible that it might help explain variations in how the brain is wired. Similarly, practice theory is not going to explain persistent adult depression, though it might contribute to better understandings of emotions more generally. An inaccurate, but still revealing way of putting the matter is that practice theory illuminates the social dimension of human existence, whereas other ways of thinking explain the biological and psychological dimensions. An advantage of putting the matter thus is that it suggests, sotto voce, that these three dimensions of human life fit together and that the corpuses of research that study them must be mutually compatible and supportive. At the same time, this way of putting the matter is misleading because distinct social, biological, and psychological realms are a fiction, and because the disciplines that investigate different aspects of human life continually evolve and occasionally hybridize, divide, or arise new, in the process redefining these erstwhile realms and the putative dividing lines among them. The starting point for getting a handle on which phenomena practice theory can analyze is to realize that a fundamental tenet of practice theory is that practices and the complexes and constellations they form are a basic reality. Human activities take place as elements of interconnected, organized arrays of activity. The significance of this fact for the present discussion is that as a basic reality, the plenum of practices forms a fundamental scaffolding or background for other dimensions of human lives. There is an underlying metaphysical assumption that the different aspects of reality fit together. I'm not sure how one would argue for that. This assumption implies that the different aspects of human life too must fit together, that is, be mutually compatible. This implication does not preclude people from, say, acting inconsistently or contrary to their beliefs. It means only that there's a broader context in which these apparently inconsistent matters fit together. Since practices form a basic reality, the facts about fetal anatomical development and brain wiring, whatever they are, must fit with activities being organized as interconnected practices. Indeed, each of these sets of facts serves as a background for the others. However, in saying that the plenum of practices forms a scaffolding or background for other dimensions of human life, I primarily have phenomena other than fetal development and brain structure in mind. And I'll give some examples in a moment. I should add that even though practices on the one hand and the human brain and anatomy on the other have often been conceptualized and studied as separate domains, it's very productive to investigate the interface and links between them. And there are some people working on this. Many social aspects of human life are analyzable as components, slices, or aspects of the complexes and constellations of practices. That's one of the defining features of practice theory. Examples are all the phenomena I mentioned earlier of which practice theory has produced illuminating analyses. Other examples are individuals and large social entities which are presently succumbing, at least I hope so, to practice theoretical analysis. But even though these social matters are aspects of the plenum of practice, and even though the conceptual armature of practice theory constantly evolves and expands, it is not likely that practice theory is going to illuminate everything about them. I already suggested this regarding individuals. Consider also in this regard interactions. An example of what practice theory has to say about interactions is that interactions take place as part of practices. The actions that make up the action chains that constitute interactions are beholden to the normative organizations of practices. This proposition, however, does not exhaust what there is to interactions. A fuller account of them must explore further matters such as physical presence, non-linguistic communication, emotional energy, a la Collins, and power differentials. It is true that the conceptual armature of practice theory can expand. Nonetheless, it's unlikely that practice theory as such will have much to say about these matters. To comprehend them, other bodies of theory must be harnessed. For example, symbolic interactionism, conversation analysis, or a Foucauldian conception of power. What's more, there are other features of human life, some social in character, and others either mental or lying at the interface between mind and social world, that are not simply slices or features of the practice plenum. The practice plenum forms a scaffolding or background for these phenomena in the sense that they take place dependent on aspects and components of the plenum, or in more philosophical language, the plenum forms a constitutive context for them. Examples of such phenomena are power, the dissemination of knowledge and ideas, experience, learning, and the constant adjustments make in the flow of conduct. Consider power. Giddens builds power right into his account of practices, though he's the only one who does that. Alternatively, the idea that practices are a basic reality can serve as the starting point for an account of power, whose filling out requires marshaling ideas from beyond practice theory, through which power is defined and its forms, sources, and modalities are analyzed. These ideas can be those of Max Weber, Stephen Lukes, Michel Foucault, or someone else. On this approach, practices simply form the constitutive context in which power, however defined, transpires. Or take experience. Practices form a context in which experience occurs. In particular, practices affect the possibilities, sequences, and modalities of experience. But this is only part of an account of experience. A fuller account must encompass matters beyond the context in which experiences occur. Comprehending experience thus requires calling on other ways of thinking, for example, phenomenology. The only stricture on which ways of thinking can be drawn on in analyzing phenomena that take place in the context of practices is that the theories not contravene the practice theoretical tenet that the plenum of practices is a basic reality. In this way, practice theory can build alliances with other theoretical approaches and traditions to provide advantageous accounts of phenomena that transpire in the context of practices, and thereby give a picture of a broader range of what makes up human life. To repeat, the main constraint on building these alliances is that these approaches be compatible with the thesis that practices are a basic reality. I believe that the stricture allows considerable free space for a range of approaches to join practice theories in broader theoretical coalitions. Okay, so this talk has offered an overview of practice theory, what it is, why it is increasingly popular, why it is not necessarily better than alternatives, what it is good for, and the frontiers where it needs to partner with other theoretical approaches in building up broader accounts of human life. I tried along the way also to give a sense of where it came from and where it is headed. And I hope that you all now have a better idea of what practices have got to do with it. So thank you.
So thank you very much, Ted, for this comprehensive overview of this vast theoretical domain. We have like 50 minutes now to have a discussion with Ted and discuss what the strengths and the weaknesses, the challenges, and practice theory has to bring. So, questions, comments? Would like to open the discussion? Bente, of course, yes?
Well, my name is Bente Elkjær, and I'm employed at Aarhus University in Copenhagen. And I would first like to thank you very much for your talk, and I think it was very rich and very difficult to follow if you had not read anything from you before, I believe. Anyway, what in a way always brings my, what shall I say, energy forward when I'm listening to people talking about practice theory is that I think that you believe that it begins in 1984 with what you also say that Sherry Ortner. But if you look a little bit back in history, and particularly American history, you'll find the great philosopher John Dewey and the whole pragmatist movement. And I believe that the term experience, you just mentioned it briefly, in many ways, at least the way that John Dewey used it, may be interpreted in much the same way as practice theory today. But I think that it's not a theory of everything, and pragmatism is certainly not a theory of everything, but I think that the experience both connote that there is some kind of agency together with agency into experience. So my question is, why don't you mention pragmatism and John Dewey or other pragmatists, and what is your take on the notion of experience having this double connotation of agency and doing something into practice? Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, so I'm glad you asked that question. The demarcation of what qualifies as practice theory is sort of a little bit of sociology of science. So I'm not I'm not looking at, for instance, at any sequence of thinkers or ideas, intellectual history that might have led up to this particular the theories being so demarcated. What I said was the first use of the expression practice theory that I know of is in 1984. And the word at that time was confined to anthropology. And it's not only until probably the turn of the century that the expression started to be used more broadly. So I'm just following out and marking what gets denoted by that concept. You then using my own take on what the features are to try to capture what is going on with this phrase. I'm in no way trying to comment. I mean, I did claim that one of the features was the background of Wittgenstein and Heidegger, and that's a factual statement. Dewey is simply not part of the background of these people. Whether he should have been, or whether he was part of the same cultural complex that Wittgenstein and Heidegger were, such that Dewey would have been a fruitful person for all these people to interact with, that's a different matter. Now, there's one other place in the talk that actually, I didn't mention this, but I could have mentioned Dewey. So I said, you know, practice theory is not likely to pronounce much on experience. It's instead going to talk about the context of experience. And I say we need to turn elsewhere, and I mentioned phenomenology. I could have mentioned Dewey there. And of course, Dewey's conception of experience is a little bit, of course, the phenomenologist had a pretty broad notion of experience too. But yes, one might want to turn to Dewey there, and then that would have implications for how one conceptualizes activity, which is another whole topic I said nothing about in the paper. And I do think that activity and experience are places where one could have maybe a fruitful dialogue between. But the people, it's not a normative conception of practice theory. It's rather just trying to chart how this word is being used and then to give a reasonable demarcation of who falls in it. And yes, I mean, who would be useful to draw other sorts of connections with is another question, and Dewey is certainly. Because of course, you know, this one thing that, actually I'm writing a paper right now on phenomenology and practice theory. And one great commonality is some type of priority of practice over the theoretical and over the cognitive. But of course, Dewey is as much associated with that as phenomenologists and practice theorists are. So yes, I mean, but to me, that's a future step to be taken. It's not one that's actually occurred.
Thanks. My name is Torben Knap, former associate professor of semiotics at different universities in Denmark and abroad. Thank you very much for your illuminating talk. Can I sit down without any danger?
Please. Yeah.
All right. Be nicer for me. I'd like to challenge you a bit on your inaugural comments on individuality versus the social field. You know, you sounded euphoric to say that you had overcome individualism, and after that stated that now we have got practice theory, and that's good enough for us. And I was thinking about your distinction between truth and usefulness, the teleological aspect of it, because I think I know that your point of departure in your philosophical stand is Heidegger and Wittgenstein, as you say. And to me, the ontology of these people bring you to think that everything already is. That is, that every human being is just put into a machine that is already running by habits and discourses and things. And the only thing that is interesting in sociology is to give an outline of what is going on in these fields and why is it so that it's going on. But in another way, you are reducing the individual person to, just a brick in the wall. So everybody is doing the same thing because they are trained into the same habits. They are, sort of. I would like to ask you, because when a new person arrives in society, a baby that has no discursive means or anything, how is this person inaugurated into this machinery of society, because when you mention Foucault, Heidegger, and so forth, they all seem to think that I know that Foucault explains this inauguration by using the Freudian upbringing of the child. That is to say that you internalize different super-ego structures that you're not aware of, that you handle your world according to. But the weakness of letting the individual out of the social field in this way is that you cannot see, or you cannot register, or you get blind for the fact that some people sometimes do something that is not a habit for them, or it's against the rules of society. It's, and you can say, well, that's just a minor case because that's only a single person. All the others are still doing the same already. You can say that some ethical questions about, I've never revived a dead person before, and I wouldn't dare to do so. But if it happened one day that one person fell dead in front of me, I would try to do it anyway. And you can mention things like that are not habit-based or practice-based, but I would say, in my beliefs, are more or less innate in the person, or our biology, or our inherent dispositions from the beginning, and you let them out. And I'll stop now. Because the usefulness of this project, I can see, is very useful in companies where things are going like machineries. In economy, you get a straight view of what's going on. I can predict what is going on in other, but it doesn't leave any place for the one that wants to drop out, like in the 60s. We don't do anything. And just to mention as the last thing, Martin Heidegger is on a recording on YouTube that you might want to see one day, in a discussion with a Buddhist monk. And here Heidegger says that everything is in the words, in the discourse. You can only realize what is going on in the world if you have internalized this discourse and things. And the Buddhist, he's not understanding a bit, because he doesn't buy this Dasein thing. He just is. I mean, he just he doesn't regard himself as a person of habits, because he leaves his habits every day by his meditation, and becomes sort of a sign and not a Dasein. Okay. I'll hold
right. The anti-individualism that I had in mind is an ontological position that claims that first, in a sense, is a negation of individualism. Individualism ontologically says that all there is to social phenomena are, in the end, or ultimately, features of individual people. So anti-individualism is simply the negation of that position, or to make it into a positive, a counter-positive, is there is something more to social life than simply individualism features. Now that is a position that that I actually go back and forth between the two in my work. But the claim is, in particular instance, that with practice theory, the organization of practices does not reduce to simply features of individuals. So that's an ontological position. Now, you have brought something further into the picture, which is a focus on regularity, routine, and habits, as you said. It is indeed the case that some practice theorists emphasize this concept. The notion of habitus might seem to suggest this in Bourdieu. The Bourdieu goes to great pains to claim it's not habits, that in fact the habitus is the source of innovation and newness. But other people like Andreas Reckwitz thinks of practices as made up of routines. That's not something I agree with. I don't think of practices as made up of regularities, routines, or habits in any sense. They may be part of it, but rather a practice is a normative domain. It's a realm of actions that are acceptable. And that can encompass regularities and irregularities. It can encompass the unexpected and the surprising, as well as the habitual. And so I don't think that further content you gave to the notion of an anti or individualism is necessarily a part of practice theory, though some practice theorists lean in that direction. In fact, the habit is not a notion I'm very fond of at all. I always have trouble understanding what a habit is. But there's plenty of room. But rather, the key factor for me, at least, and there's another practice theorist named Joe Rouse, who I didn't mention at all, who's written some nice articles contrasting regularity theories of practice and normative domain theories. So I think the key concept, in a way, in organization is normativity. It's what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. It's what's prescribed and is not prescribed. And this phenomenon organizes human life, but that leaves plenty of room for surprise and singularities and new starts and so forth. So yeah, the individualism is purely, anti-individualism is purely this more rarefied ontological, really philosophical type of issue about what's the stuff out of which social life is made.
All right.
Thank you. I'm Bente Hedker from Roskilde University. Thank you very much for a very nice talk. I liked that you said that practice theories should not become a theory of everything. Basically, that is meaningless, I think. And I also like your vision about making some sort of ontological or theoretical division of labor. So one of the things that I see as being primarily an empirical researcher in sociology and communication is that there are a lot of these people out there doing research who belongs to what you call practice-based accounts, and that you didn't want to say anything about, but now I'm maybe challenging you a bit to say a little bit about that anyway, and relations to what you consider to be belonging to practice theory. So the case is that in empirical, especially in applied empirical research these years, in social sciences at least, the practice-based accounts treat all sorts of other theories as being very compatible with their notion of what practice theories might be in practice-based accounts. And I'd like you to say perhaps a little bit more about where you think the limits are to which theories you can combine with practice theory, apart from the very obvious answer that it's compatibility, that's the main criteria for what you can combine. So what does compatibility mean in practice when you're out there in the practice-based accounts, in applied research, and not in the nice theoretical debates about practice theories?
So who have you got in mind when you say talk about
Well,
practice?
for instance, the whole business of finding out how to make the world a better place with sustainable design and sustainable consumption, etc. This is at least one field where you can say, talk about health communication and health behavior changes, etc. All these two fields in particular, lots of applied research are now sort of calling upon them working on practice-based accounts, and they are sort of in between working on that and working with practice theories.
Can you mention some names?
Well,
People, that helps me locate what you've got in mind.
well, it doesn't really, it's not a kind of, my point isn't to pinpoint anybody in
Right.
particular and say they're doing bad research, but I suppose that when you said that you you mentioned yourself practice-based accounts as something that you would not talk about because you thought they were different to practice theories. This is what came to my mind, that there's a lot of that out there. And in which ways do you feel that they don't sort of belong to the nice real family of practice theories, so to speak, that must have something to do with what they combine and what they do empirically, and which kind of rules they violate in relation to practice theories?
Right. I mean, the reason I asked for names was only that there are a lot of different people that might use words that are kind of similar, and they sort of represent different ideas and sort of comment on what's the relationship to what I'm more narrowly calling practice theory. I mean, what I meant by practice-based accounts is, I mean, that's very widespread expression in organizational studies. And so it's associated with names like Nicolini and Girardi. And for them, what practice means situated action, just to say it in a nutshell. Because I remember reading an article by Sylvia Girardi once, and she had a chart which showed all the intellectual predecessors for her work, or what she was calling practice-based studies. And I looked at the chart, and it was all familiar names, and then I thought, there isn't a single practice theorist on the chart. And I thought, how can this be? I mean, she's talking about practice-based studies. So I thought about it and finally realized that what she meant by practice was situated action. Now, there are other publications of hers where she doesn't think of practices as situated actions, but actually has a sense of organized activities, which is what I'm using as a dividing line. But there's nothing, I mean, to me, there is some ontological significance in putting the dividing line there because of talking about, the anti-individualism, which coming out of philosophy, individualism is still the king, both in philosophy and in social thought. And so that's just always a constant reference point. So I mark it that way. But there's a big difference between talking about situated action and then bringing in different sorts of contexts to conceptualize that situatedness, which is what that chart did. And had all these different people there, and including Mead and Garfinkel and quite a potpourri of folks. And so that was thinking about that, I realized they were not using the notion of practice in any systematic or theoretical way, really. It was shorthand just for situated action. But for me, if you want to combine with practice theories, as I'm defining them more narrowly, the other theories have to be compatible with this idea that practices are a basic reality, and that they form a context in which other dimensions of human life go on. So to talk about the conduct of everyday life, or people's emotions, or the dissemination of knowledge and ideas, these are all occurring on the background of practices. That means they are dependent in some sense or other on the practices. But you got to study them in their own right to understand how they're working. I think learning is very much that sort of thing. Learning is, to me, a very mysterious thing in a lot of ways. So that, to me, that's for building out alliances, that becomes the demarcation. Is are they able to accept that practice, these complexes of practices, are a omnipresent background supporting whatever it is that they're looking at, and then it's ripe for an alliance instead of Now the other way to go is to try to build out practice theory so it conquers every realm. But I mean, that seems crazy to me. So did I answer your question?
You did, yes.
More questions?
My name is Andreas Wittbach. I'm a researcher in the technology policy group here. And I want to thank you for a very clear talk, I think it was actually. And I think also quite nicely informed by your own insistence on practices, because it seems to me to be very much about how practice theory is practiced. And my question is, what some of the advantages and perhaps also disadvantages might be in insisting on this label of theory when discussing practices. And I have two main reasons for posing the question. Maybe it gets longer when you answer. But the first one is that I wonder what happens to practices that are exactly per definition always situated and not completely articulatable when you then theorize them and put them on general terms, which the notion of theory signalizes. And secondly, I wonder whether practice methodology would be acceptable as an alternative term, because it seems to me that the main content you gave in the beginning of your talk was that we needed to always attend to the practice side of things when we go out and study phenomena in the world.
Okay, what I said about language specifically was that there's this view that you might say there's a condition of human beings, a practical condition, that their activity realizes, yet cannot be fully captured in words. And so all these words that people use, practical consciousness, habitus. A theorist, that cannot be captured in words. It may be that a theorist, in fact, all practitioners would say that's not all there is to the determination of human activity, though. So take somebody like Bourdieu, whose habitus is about as close as you can get to an all-encompassing explanatory mechanism for human activity. He admits that there are formulations in life, rules, he calls them, and that different domains of practice can vary to the extent to which there are active in them formulated rules. And so for him, you could capture in words some of how it works in a given domain by latching on identifying what the rules are. But what you couldn't put into words is somehow the logic of the habitus. Now, those of you who know Bourdieu know that he actually wrote a lot about logic, the practical logic. In fact, the second half of his book, here's a guy who is cited, what, 1 million times? And the second half of his magnum opus is never referred to. And that's the second half, is all about the logic of practice, where he tries to provide a logic to capture the operations of habitus, using logical principles and all, though they're not deductive logic. Anyway, so, I mean, nobody ever writes about this. I'm not quite sure why. So it's not the case that when you want to analyze practices, it's not that you can't say anything about them. I mean, I think, for instance, you can say a lot, but not certain things. And in particular, this idea of a practical capacity is a challenge to the standard kind of way of thinking that we must be completely explicable in words. And that is, of course, the hope, was the hope. Artificial intelligence started off that way and has had to switch gears to acknowledge, to somehow incorporate this into their ways of understanding. As for practice methodology, I'm not a good person to ask about methodology. I'm not sure I'm not sure how useful that expression is. What is true is one has to think well about how to study practices. And there are some people, in fact, there's a book that is coming out, is it June yet? It is June, it's coming out this month, about practice methodology with Rutledge. So there'll be some, but yes, that needs to be done, because right now it's just been people kind of attracted to the ideas, using them to study this and that. And I'd say there's, especially students ask, what's the methodology involved? And I think it isn't that there's some special methodology. It's just, attentive use to certain methodologies and maybe thinking about how to develop those those in particular ways. So, but I'm not the right person to ask. Someone who does empirical research would be a better person. I mean, I can suggest, afterwards I can suggest names to you of people that do think about this.
My name is Bente Mosgaard. I'm coming from Aarhus University, and I'm a PhD student. I'm one of Anders' PhD students from some years ago. Thank you for your speech. It was very interesting. Being in a university here, I'm very interested in feedback practices in higher education. And I would like, and you have talked just a little bit about learning, and I would like to ask you if you could say something more about how you understand learning as situated in a university. The problem is that what students learn in a university must be the practices of the university and not the practices that they are heading for. And that is a big problem as I see it. How can we understand that how can we understand that knowledge that they achieve at university as come out of a practice?
Well, I gather that Klaus Holzkamp thought all education is that way. That in the first place, you're learning the practices of education, and then if you're lucky, you're learning about the subject matter. I'd have to think about an answer to that question. I do think that it's both in some way, that we are all introduced to formalized practices of education necessarily, and maybe I'd say there's actually, certainly when you're younger, even when you go to the university, there's very little training in that. There may be what we call in the States remedial students, as students who are really challenged at the university. There you might actually teach them about university practices, or give them, certain tasks and projects that could help them, engage the practices that are available. But the real issue there to me is what is being taught, or what is put into the curriculum? How does that connect? And that's not in the first. It's connected, the practice theory, only insofar as one thinks, or it's connected in particular to practice theory only insofar as practice theory conceptualizes what you'd be doing later on in terms of practices. But it seems to me, regardless of how one thinks about social life, that same issue arises. What's the connection between what is learned and what one does later on? So I'm not sure. I'd have to think more about whether practice theory is different than other sort of accounts of sociality as to what the implications are for that issue. It could be, obviously, issues about, practical capacities that cannot be formulated. That has important pedagogical implications, but practice theory is not the only, way of thinking that accepts that idea. But it is prominent in practice theory, so one is faced with a pedagogy where a lot of it is necessarily wordless in some way. But I'm sorry, I have to think more about it. It's not something I really thought much about.
I'm sorry to take the word again, since I've already done it once, but it was this thing about studying practices. And I do believe that our colleague, Davide Nicolini, has actually done a splendid book on studying practices with all the different practice theories and lots of methods. And I also think our colleague Silvia Gerardi, in her book Knowing in Organizing. So if you are interested in studying organizations or workplaces, I would suggest you to start with those two good colleagues. They work very much with what's a unit of analysis and how do you use the term practice as a unit of analysis. How do you at the one time look at the doings and the actions and also situate the practices in the wider in the wider institutionalization processes. So I would definitely suggest you to start there. Thank you.
Well, let me make one comment about David's book, because David's book, it's kind of like that chart in Sylvia's article that I read. There's quite a collection of what I would say are quite different approaches in that book that all get collected together as, it's not even practice-based, it's practice theory, which is fine. I have no objection to that. But I do think, though, that his metaphor of the toolbox is potentially dangerous, because let me think if I can think of a parallel here. If you, I don't know. My worry is that the ideas, he says, the different theories that he goes through the different chapters provide different tools that you can use to study. The problem is the tools are not all compatible with one another, and that you actually land yourself in contradiction to speak philosophically, if you combine some of them. So not all tools go together is the problem. And I don't think that's an issue. Well, there's some footnotes in which he shows that he's aware that this is a problem he set up in the book, but he doesn't go on to sort of to solve that problem. So that I just put a little bit of cautionary. It's a good book to read. I'm happy to recommend it as well. But I think, to me, there's an interesting issue here that I've encountered a lot, especially with students, who sort of pick concepts from different theoretical approaches and just combine them. And at a pragmatic level, it often works just fine. When you start trying to think about the implications of what a given study conceptualized with ultimately contradictory concepts tells you more theoretically, then you run into problems. And it's fine for people who stay at the pragmatic level to combine, but it can get you in trouble. And somebody who's theoretically inclined, like myself, has the luxury of kind of worrying a little bit about where that lands you. I think it especially shows that we need a particular example in front of us, but if you're interested in intervening in social life, you can sometimes get contradictory implications when you borrow the wrong concepts that don't really fit together. So I'm speaking very abstractly here, but this is a widespread phenomenon. It's very understandable with people that have not spent a long time with the different theories. In other words, I believe it's better to pick a favorite theory and to stick with it instead of to draw ideas from multiple sources and combine them. But that's a very rough rule of thumb, and I'm saying nothing, substantial here to back that up.
So we still have time for a few more questions. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Kirsten Gram-Hansen, and I am here from Aalborg University, work with everyday life, energy consumption, sustainable consumption. And thank you for your talk. In the beginning, you said one of the common things about practice theory was the way to include, or not the way to include, but to include the materiality. But you also said it was done in different ways. I think yourself would say that it's outside of the practices, and a lot of others working, it shows, especially would say that it's part of putting the practices together. And I wonder if you could elaborate on what you think the two differences is in doing this, both theoretically and how that would influence more empirically work.
Okay. By the way, when I mention materiality, it's not a defining feature because everybody talks about materiality these days. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, let's take the furnace and the heating system in your house or your apartment. That's a material arrangement. My view is that the practices are the organized activities, and they are very intimately connected with the material arrangements. So you have various practices that are connected with the heating system. You could have a view to say the heating system is itself part of the practices. I mean, where it comes down to a difference is that to speak with the independent, to say that they're distinct but closely connected, allows for a greater, you might say, changeover and a redoing of the connection of human practices to the material arrangements, such that you can have one change without the others, or you can have a succession of one set of human beings leaves, another set of human beings arrives. There are ways of accommodating every situation either way. So to me, these are alternatives that empirically you can make good use of either way. Elizabeth Shove is somebody who is, if you know her theories, she thinks of practices as made up of 3 types of elements that combine. One of these elements is materiality, so that builds the materiality right into the practice. I mean, to her, she realizes that sometimes, to speak of the movement of the material elements as she does, introduces some theoretical problems, because what exactly is moving them? If the elements are components of it. But to me, empirically, you can go either way. And it's really what just sits better when you're describing a given phenomena. And to me, I like just the idea that you can have a wholesale even changeover in the practices and the arrangements stay the same. And it just creates a little bit more flexibility in your conceptual scheme. But you can read it, you can describe anything using either, any human phenomena, that is, social phenomena, using either way.
Brief.
I was just raising my hand because I didn't think anybody else was, but then I will ask my question anyway. I'm going back to this problem about multiple ontologies that you talked about, because referring to my own question before, I'd say that I think you need to have an ontology that includes both the individual and the social, because they are actually living in the same world. And sometimes people are together, sometimes they are not, but that doesn't change the world, just our research interest or our framing of it according to our interests. So it's especially intriguing to me because nowadays you see a lot of scholars around talking about practices, discourses, structures that goes around in the social, like people living and working in the social area are totally unaware of what they are doing themselves. Like, they just, as I said before, bricks in the walls or players in a play. Where I think sometimes you say, I'm not part of this. When the new academic feminists say, it's a patriarchal society we are living in, we are suppressed, that's the way it is. I think they sort of frame a special social area and heave it up to the truth about how the world is. And to me, being a humanistic guy that wouldn't oppress and would be very aware of women's problems, it offends me. So but in their the feminist research, it's very useful because they have a political agenda, for instance, for saying what they're doing. And they can show all in all, it's this way. And like you can say in structures of institutions or workplaces, that's all in all how it is. But it doesn't give rise to the thinking of what is the individual's role in this play. And when do they follow and when do they not follow and things like that.
Yeah, good. Let me put that in practice, vis-a-vis practice theories. So on the one hand, practices are made of actions. Actions are performed by people. Maybe pencils and machines too, I don't know. But let's just stick with people. The actions are performed by people. So in one sense, people are everywhere in practices. If there are no people, there are no practices. On the other hand, practice theory, like many forms of post-World War II social thought, is true, I would agree with you, has had a restricted notion of the individual. An individual is a participant in practices. And so you conceptualize and approach the individual as a participant. And then you get this familiar kind of quasi-structuralist, post-structuralist way of thinking that an individual person is a compendia of different, as Chantal Mouffe made people talk, different subject positions. Or you can be a participant in different practices. Now, I would agree there's more to individual people than that. And it is true that practice theorists have tended not to talk much about that. That's the way why I put the criticism in the paper, as they're fixated on practices and the connections among practices, and just kind of forget to say more about practices. But that's where I want to talk about theoretical alliances, is that there are all kinds of bodies of scientific thought that, in a broad sense, that think about individuals. And if you want a fuller picture of human life now, as opposed to social life, which I think practice theory is more focused on, then in fact an alliance, one that also tells you a lot about individuals, will give you a broader, more robust picture of things. So I would agree with you. Practice theories vary a bit on this. Some of them are a little bit more, attentive, but generally what I was saying, I think holds up, and I think I don't want to say I was guilty, but I've always been interested in the notion of mind and action, and mind and motion and teleology has always been, to me, you couldn't do practice theory without it, but that's, so I sort of agree with you.
So who will pose the last question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Victoria. I'm a student here. This is a short question, but it might be complex. I've tried to find something in your text about sustainability and what makes a practice sustainable. I know it's a huge question, but something we were talking about in the group as well, because we know what causes change, but what makes a practice more sustainable than other practices?
Yes. I can tell you how I would go about thinking about that instead of trying to do that here. I think about, there are a number of things. First, you have to think of what a practice is made out of and ask about those things, about their sustainability. So, for instance, is it the ability to act for certain ends? Is that easily maintained? Or to go to the other end, the actual practical understandings you have in your body about how to carry out actions through bodily movements. Are those easy to see? In a paper I wrote, I gave the example about handwriting, where my children cannot really write by hand anymore. It's stunning, and nor can their friends. It's illegible. And so the question is, what range of practices sustainability would be threatened by losing that type of practical understanding? And then there are questions of materiality. You need some practices need certain settings. So are those easy to maintain? And then you have to look at connections among practices. Sometimes practices need certain connections. Like, for instance, if you're dependent on resources that come from somewhere else, you need the setup to provide the resource. How sustainable is that? So that's how I would go about that. There's probably not much of a general answer to questions like that. It's more looking at specific cases and seeing which of these sorts of factors are more or less, maintainable, and what's required for their maintenance, or alternatively, what's required to change them. Since that's what usually people ask is, how do we achieve a sustainable practices or achievable sustainable energy use? And you have to look then at the practices in which energy is being used and see where the points of access are, and conceptualizing that in practice theoretical terms. And then, of course, you have different practice theories that will conceptualize that situation differently. And to me, the best test of which practice theory is better is, well, which one enables you actually to answer the question in a sensible way that actually gives you routes for intervention. That makes it the best theory then, not truth.
Okay, so time is approaching 4 o'clock and we're about to close this session. And I think we want to say a few words in the closing before we go to the reception.
I want to hand you some flowers, which symbolize our hopes for the collaboration. We are going to start now.
Can I get them back home to the United States?
That's your problem. This is a problem-based university, and when we have a problem, we just analyze it and find a solution. Either you bring it to your room in the hotel, or you find a nice lady, or, we have lots of solutions to that problem. But that's another story. Now we are in theory, so you work with it on a theoretical basis. Yeah? No. They should be very nice. They should be very nice and symbolize our very nice collaboration in the future.
Good. Thank you very much.